Hello and good afternoon. I'm so excited to be here with you today and appreciate the invitation. We're going to talk for the next hour or so about child welfare transformation and what that might look like, some examples of ways that we're building that next step, and some things that are just in really early design and ideation stage about where the future of our work is headed. So I'm Amelia Franck, and I am from an organization called Amelia, and Amelia is based in St. Paul, and we work all over the country in different jurisdictions, helping child welfare leaders to build better ways of work. We talk about our work really in two kinds of sets. One is practice where we're building the capacity for change, so doing training and supporting the workforce, developing leaders, and doing strategy. And the other is really doing the transformative work in the innovation side of our house. And I'll talk a little bit more deeply about the innovation side today in ways that we're building new work together. We are based in, as I said, St. Paul, and based on the framework of know better, do better, be better. And this means we start by helping shift mindsets. So when people know better, then they do better. So then we work side by side to help them to do the work differently. And the idea is that all of us, children, families, and the workforce will be better because of it. So that's a bit of the work that we do. So I'd love to start with this chat question to ask you, if you could change one thing about the current child welfare system, what would that be? What would that be? So I'll invite you to use the chat for that, to just write in even just a few words around if you had a magic wand today and you were going to change something about the current child welfare system, what would that be? And so I'm seeing caseloads are too high, mandatory rehab for foster parents, increasing pay. What other bright ideas do you have? Multiple community partners co-located. Monica, I'd love to hear more about birth parents. What about them? More reunifications. Here we go. Better support for birth parents, consistency across our systems. What else are we seeing? More prevention focused, more proactive, less reactive. Yeah. What does that look like on the ground if you're more proactive and family-centered? Yeah. So more support for the workforce and some change in the laws. So I'll tell you, I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and up until very recently, almost all of the things I got asked to talk about were building the case for why things need to change, right? So people, I think this idea that the system really needs to have a dramatic shift is kind of catching momentum these days. Everybody's always thought it needed some help, but a dramatic reform, a dramatic reconstruction, a reimagining of what could happen here, that momentum is picking up in recent days and times. And so, you know, there are a lot of things that we could change, the more resources, more support. And I'm seeing here, you know, for domestic violence, for birth parents, etc. But, you know, I think we're coming to a great alignment where we generally all believe that things need to change. And now our work is coming together to say, and in what ways should it change? How might we change it, right? How might we shift the system? And so I have some thoughts on this. In particular, I want to show you a diagram that is one of my very favorite, that I think really talks about so many of our system challenges right now. So I'm particularly talking about child welfare, but that is not unlike what is happening in education, in police reform, in our democracy, in juvenile and criminal justice, right? So these are all systems that we're looking at as a society and saying, they're not working the way we had really hoped. They're not producing the desired outcomes, and we think some fundamental reform or shift is necessary here in order for these systems to work better for the people that they serve. And I want to show you a diagram by Meg Wheatley here in a minute that really helps me understand what's happening in so many of our systems, right? It's why we're all feeling, well, there's many reasons why we're all feeling overwhelmed and exhausted, and like the whole world is turning at a pace faster than we can keep up with. But this helps me put a frame of reference on what's actually happening here. And in particular, you know, I'll think about this and talk about this from the child welfare perspective, but just to give you an idea. So this is about an evolution of a system. And if you think to yourself, what really is a system? A system is a bunch of humans hanging out together with some agreed assumptions and ways of being together. And when we come together, we act and behave in ways that create systems, at least these kinds of public institution systems, yeah? And so let's just walk through this quickly because I think it's super enlightening in terms of what's happening. So when you form a system, you have some beginning assumptions you can see here on the left, a base set of assumptions that say, you know, we believe certain things about what needs to happen, about the definition, the common shared definition of what the problem is and how we fix it. Yeah, that's how systems start. And so then a system is born, right? We start beginning to develop a system, and all systems, because they're made up of humans, have developmental life cycles, just like humans do. So when a system matures and gets to the point of maturity here in the center, it's everybody's job in the system to protect the status quo. So you'll see all of the positions line up to the same set of ideals, all the funding streams, all the programs, all the supporting resources line up to continue to meet the original set aside goals of the system and to hold the system up as the status quo. And eventually, we know better. We learn more. We see what the outcomes are. We see the unintended impacts. And the system begins to start to fail because we realize that it's not producing the desired outcomes, or we've learned more from the research. And we know that that system has outlived its useful life and needs to be, if you will, put into hospice and set aside. And then our job is to come together to say, well, if we don't do that, what else do we do, right? It's to build a new way. And once we build a new way, then we transition those resources and people to the new way of work. And that system too will develop, mature, and then outlive its usefulness based on the information at the time. So just think about other systems like this. We're thinking about mass incarceration. We're thinking about police reform, that we're thinking so hard about how do we build new ways of being together. And so if you look at this diagram too, you'll see these little dots over on the left, right? The innovators, pioneers, and trailblazers. So when a system begins to fail, these innovators, pioneers, and trailblazers start saying, I have a model for that. I have an idea for that. I have a way to fix it. And what you end up with is where our workforce is right now, which is they've been trained in tons of models, you know, and they're trying to figure out, when I'm in front of a family, how do I bring together, you know, differential response and solution-based casework and you know, triple P or any other intervention that you've been trained in. How do you bring them all together when you're sitting down with a human? And so what Meg Wheatley says is that until you start connecting these people who are making change together and then resource and come to an agreed upon way of change, nothing ever changes. And I also want to say, so that, you know, that's where we are right now, is trying to come together to build new ways. I also want to just talk about these beginning assumptions, because embedded in the development of this system that we're working in now, this child welfare system, embedded in this system and in many other of our systemic structures right now, is this idea of, you know, what worthy poor are and unworthy poor, who deserves help and who doesn't, who deserves it, and then other assumptions that are based in individual bias and systemic racism. So the beginning assumptions, if we're really honest with ourselves about the way child welfare started, was in a foundation of family separation, that children were better off with other kinds of families, and very specifically, Black, brown, and indigenous children were better off with whiter families, or poorer children were better off with wealthier families, or thinking about, children who were in conditions where other families could give them a better life because of their privilege. And so there is an enormous amount of individual bias and systemic racism built into the beginning assumptions upon which our system was built. And if for that reason alone, if only that existed, it would be our obligation, now knowing better, to build new ways of work strictly on that. But on top of that, on top of knowing the embedded racism and bias built into our system, we also know that we don't have evidence for this way of work that we are doing now. There is not good evidence for us to continue working in child welfare the way we are working. At Amelia, one of the pieces of work we do is to harvest data and information and to share that with the field. And so one of the pieces that we released last year was the evidence base for avoiding family separation in child welfare practice. And what we learned is that for children who have experienced maltreatment, out-of-home placement provides little to no measurable benefit in terms of cognitive or language outcomes, academic achievement, mental health, behavioral health, or suicide risk. And what we've found is that it increases their risk of harm, it increases their risk of juvenile and adult criminal behavior, increases their risk of a reactive attachment disorder, increases their risk of early mortality. And children who are placed with kin are shown to have greater placement stability, fewer emotional and behavioral problems during placement, and a lower incidence of reactive attachment disorder, and more connections to their biological, social, and cultural communities. And so the practice of separating families is not based in the best and current research, and we don't have evidence to continue to do this in many, many cases. As we know, about 80% of the children who come into our system do not come in for abuse and are likely tied to neglect, which is related to poverty and racism in many cases. We also conducted another study, a social return on investment study, which looked at, for every dollar we invest in placing children in foster care, group, or residential, so in every dollar we invest in separating children from their families, what do we get back as a society and societal return? This study was done by Ecotone Analytics, who share a data analyst with the World Bank. And what they found is that for every dollar invested in doing the work the way we do it, when we do it at our best, when we do it well, we lose $3.64. And when we do the work how we typically do in a more typical setting, we lose $9.55. And that multiplier is on a federal investment of $29.9 billion invested in child welfare. So we don't have evidence from the research. We don't have evidence from the social return on investment studies. We don't have evidence from the outcomes for children who spend time in care. We don't have evidence from the voices of families. We don't have evidence to continue our work as we have continued it, as we have done it. And that means that we need to be thinking about new ways of work. So that's a heavy load I just laid on you. And before I move on to the next piece of this, I'm wondering, what do you think of that? Does that resonate with you? Does that seem right to you? Is that stuff you've thought of before? Or is there a new piece of it? But I'm wondering if you can either share in the chat, or if you're feeling brave and want to unmute, I'm wondering how that's landing on you. Does that seem right? All righty. And then in the chat, I have just this lens about systemic racism And how does parental drug use factor into the research? It still does. Actually, there's studies of heroin addicted parents that the separation of the children is more detrimental to the child than keeping children with the parents. And hear me say this, because I'm going to need to clarify this for you. I am not in favor of keeping children in dangerous situations with parents who can't parent. Who can't safely parent. What I'm super interested in is helping parents to safely parent. And right now, our intervention is removal of the child, and then we let parents be, right? So good luck to you. Here's a referral to a drug treatment. I hope you decide to go and make good choices, right? And we all know that in addiction, it isn't really about the choices we make. It's really about the trauma we've experienced. It's about the fact that those parents are very much the children that we're so concerned about today in grown-up bodies. It's that they didn't get what they need when they were younger and likely endured the same abuse or worse and haven't had an opportunity to heal that. And so just as an intervention of rescuing, removing, and separating children and blaming and shaming parents will get us nowhere, because I promise you the evidence is clear about the lifelong predictive harm of family separation. So those kids are going to go ahead and get raised up, and what are they going to do? They're going to become adults with drug problems and have more kids, and then we're going to take their kids too, because that creates a primal wound. That separation of that attachment is a primal wound. And when we repeat it intergenerationally, what we know from the research is we can expect to see the impact of that separation, the impact of that intergenerational trauma for up to 7 generations forward. What we're learning about epigenetics, what we're learning about the importance of belonging and attachment, and I say what we're learning, but friends, we have known this for nearly a century. You all studied the Harlow monkey studies in your Psych 101, and I promise you, indigenous wisdom has known this for centuries before that. This is not new knowledge to humans, but we are ignoring the reference base, we're ignoring the research, we're ignoring the knowledge base, and we're doing the quick, easy fix. And it's not very exciting to a lot of people to want to help parents in order to help children, but it's exactly what must happen. And our funding streams are not tied that way. And our workforce isn't tied that way, because they are all tied, if you go back to the Meg Wheatley diagram, to protecting the status quo, which is to support family separation. And it's why we have to build new ways together. Because if you care at all about children, you must care about their parents. Because every baby on the face of the earth needs for their mama and their daddy to be okay. They do not need your therapy or your treatment. They don't need your programs or your services. They need their parents to be okay. And so our work must be in helping parents to be able to safely parent. That is the role of our work. And if you want to ask about the new way of work, it is built on that. It's built on helping parents to safely parent. Absolutely, Courtney, we need to change the laws surrounding the funding. Absolutely. Absolutely, we do. And that'll happen as we continue to push this forward and build the movement and momentum for people to understand. Because what I'm saying to you, many people on the street do not understand clearly, right? They're still in the place of who deserves support and who doesn't. And there are lots of people who would rather spend $100 than give you $1 you didn't earn. And so if you grew up with childhood trauma and you're using drugs and alcohol to numb that trauma because you never got your help, you don't deserve help anymore, because you're grown and you should make better choices. And I'm putting that in air quotes, because when you are dealing with trauma and addiction, your choices are gone. So I come from a place that says parents love their children. Every person is doing the best they can, and they can't do it on sometimes because of what happened to them. And that's where we come in. Right? That's where we come in. Oh, I hope Jessica's not regretting asking me to talk yet. Okay, so I'm going to go back on to my other piece of the PowerPoint. So let's talk about how this goes here. So as we're talking about this, we know that we don't have evidence, and so that means that we've got to do it differently, not just a little better, because I'm working in systems that They're model systems. I'm working with the top in the nation. They take in fewer kids than anyone in the country, right? Like the state of New Jersey takes in 4,000 children a year. In LA County today, there are 38,000 children in the county of LA. 38,000 children living separate from their family. So I'm working with like the best of the best, and guess what? It's still bad. So even when you polish it up and you do it to the maximum, like you just excel at the current system, it's still not good for children and families. And so this is one of my favorites. Came from a guy named Chuck Price, who was a county director who had separation from the county for overachieving. Not because a child was hurt, not because a child passed away, but because he started to develop outcomes so good that it threatened the status quo. And this is something he shared with me. The electric light did not come from the continuous improvement of candles. Our system is not broken. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Separate kids from their families and give them to better families. That's what it's designed to do. It's doing just that. So we can't make it better. We have to do it differently. It'd be like, you know, another way to say this is Henry Ford, you know, didn't develop the car by breeding faster horses. It's a different thing. And so how do we do it differently? So I believe that part of the challenge is that we are trying to solve some problems in a way that's not getting us where we want to go because we're solving the wrong problems. Right? We're solving the wrong problem. So let me just say a word about this. So when I go into child welfare agencies, and I work all over the country and in Canada in child welfare agencies, and I often ask them, you know, what's the biggest problem you're facing? What are you facing? Anybody know what they say to me? What do they say to me? What's your biggest challenge? What's your biggest problem? Who's got it? Turnover of staff. I often hear about compassion fatigue in the, compassion fatigue and retention or turnover challenges, youth stuck in the system, permanency for older youth, and then Jessica threw me a softball here, which is what I was looking for, which was not enough foster homes. Not enough foster homes. So people say, we just can't find enough people to take care of these kids. So we're separating from their families, and we're blaming and shaming their families, and then we don't have enough people who are willing to take them when they are exhibiting these behaviors as a result of their pain from being separated. Yeah, and so we don't have enough families. So that is treating the problem like a supply problem. Like there's not enough supply of families. But what if we thought about that problem like a demand problem? What if we started to say, we have more than enough foster parents, actually quite a few, more than enough. What we have too many of is the demand. We have too many kids living separate from their family. And if we solve that problem, we would have an overabundance of foster homes, would we not? Or we can keep trying to get more foster homes to take care of more and more traumatized kids and disregarding their families, and we'll never have enough. And so we've got kids right now all over this country living in hotel rooms, in overcrowded shelter, in all kinds of places. So thinking about that, I'll give you another example of supply and demand, thinking about our problems differently. So we're located in St. Paul, and the county attorney there, when he first came, was really focused on reducing human trafficking. And so what he did wasn't to start arresting all of the folks who were in human trafficking and putting them in jail. What he did instead is he went to alleys at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, commonly known for trafficking, and they started taking pictures of license plates in those alleys and sending letters with pictures of the license plates to the female heads of households saying, your car was seen at 2:36 a.m. in an alley known for human trafficking. That's curbing demand. That's not rounding up and jailing supply. That's curbing demand. So you see what I'm saying? Looking at the problems differently. Yeah, look at them differently. I'm glad it makes sense to you, Monica. That's awesome. All right, so here is one of my very favorites, which is Buckminster Fuller. So he talks about you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. To change something, you build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. So after 30 years, I consider myself a builder, not a fighter. I'm not trying to blow anything up. I don't want to blow up the system, right? I'm trying to build something that works better because we all know that needs to change. The challenge is how and what do we do? So I want to give you an example. Anybody remember this place? Yeah, they used to be everywhere, right? I mean, how many Friday and Saturday nights do you spend in this place? Hours and hours being kind and rewinding. What happened to this place? Who knows what happened? What happened to our good friends at Blockbuster that were on every single corner? What happened to them?
They went out of business, right?
Yeah, why?
Netflix.
Actually, it was Redbox first, then Netflix, but that's right. Redbox, then Netflix. And so why would Blockbuster go out of business if Redbox came and then Netflix? So friends, I'm from Minnesota. I don't like to go outside in the snow on a Friday and Saturday night. You know, I have to get dressed and go out and slug over there and then fight with my kids in the store, you know, my big kids saying, you know, I want to rent this and I want to rent that. And oh, by the time you decided they're out of that one, it was ridiculous. And then you have to take it back over there. Say again?
Supply and demand.
That's right. Yeah, that's right, Kimberly. So, and it's this idea like it's so much easier. If you build a better way, just do that, right? Just do that. So, so really thinking about how might we build a better way that solves so many of our problems. So far, I'm going back to your problems, friends. Caseloads are too high, not enough funding, turnover, people are exhausted. You know, if you didn't take kids into care, all those problems go away. Those are problems we made. We made those problems. So we have to solve at the source. You know, we can put Band-Aids on all those problems or go back and figure out, and again, we all have the same goal. We want to keep kids safely. You want to keep them safe, right? So, but we're solving the wrong problem. We're not, our problem is not right now, how do we keep kids safely together with their families? That's not the problems we're solving. We're solving turnover and compassion fatigue and not enough foster homes and not enough funding and the, you know, ASFA law. We're solving all these other problems that don't get to what's really going on here. All right. So, how do we build the red box? How do we build the Netflix, right? How do we do stuff that makes it so much better, so much easier that people just start doing that and the other thing goes away? That's what we're talking about. So I was pretty sure I wasn't going to come up with that idea by myself. So I invited 100 innovators from around the country to help me solve it. This is May 2017 in Minneapolis. And for 4 days, we worked with a global design firm who does human-centered design called IDEO. And they're out of the Stanford Design School and they're in San Francisco. And for 4 days, they came with 100 people to solve this design question. How might we redesign a better child welfare system? And we had 10 people, we call it 10 of 10 for kids because we had 10 of each kind. 10 federal and tribal innovators, 10 state innovators, 10 county innovators, 10 nonprofit innovators, 10 child welfare specialists, so American Academy of Pediatrics sent people, psychologists, educators, 10 innovation fellows like MacArthur and Bush and Ashoka foundations, 10 people who do just nothing about child welfare so they could say, you do what? What? Tell me again. Why would you do that? I needed people who were checking us at the tables. 10 people who had lived experience, so they lost kids to the system or grew up in the system. Turned out more than a third of the people had lived experience because they're also running systems. And 10 philanthropists and, you know, you get the idea, right? So 10 of 10, one of each kind of people at each table. And for 4 days, they worked and developed 30 different ways to create a better child welfare system. And we looked at all this data and coded all this data. And in the end, here's what we learned. We learned we asked them the wrong question. Are you kidding me? I mean, 4 days, 100 people. I fundraised a lot of money to make this happen. we asked the wrong question. So the question isn't, how might we redesign a better child welfare system? Because the question should have been, right? When families struggle, as they do, as yours does, as mine does, right? When families struggle, as all families do, because why? Because we're human and no humans are perfect. And I promise you, I teach all this stuff. I teach trauma-informed parenting. I scream at my kids like you've never seen, right? If you caught me on YouTube, I'd be out of a job, right? Because we're human. We're all doing our best, but not quite making it. And so here we go. What's the right question? The question is, when families struggle as they do, how do we keep them safely together? When families struggle, how do we keep them safely together? So what they said to us is, you asked us the wrong question, because when it works well, the perfect child welfare system already exists. And it's called the family, and every child's born into it. The trouble is sometimes it doesn't work well, and our question needs to be, what do we do then? And so they came up with this idea. We came up with this idea after we coded all 450 pieces of evaluation with a nationally recognized evaluator. And what we said is basically the traditional system is based on undermining family systems, family bonds. It blames, shames, punishes, and disconnects. Blames, shames, punishes, and disconnects when there's trouble. Right? When there's trouble in the family, we dissolve the family, or we blame and shame or punish people in the family. And so it's like the house is on fire and we show up with some gasoline some of the time, right? And instead what they said is, we don't need that system. We need a different system that's not that system. And we call it an unsystem, not the unsystem, because there's not one right way. Every community will have their own right way. But the unsystem means we need to unravel that big system bureaucracy we have built around family separation, and instead build it around family well-being and supporting healthy development. And what does an unsystem look like? It looks like the whole family at the center. It looks like focusing on building resilience, joy, well-being, and health. It looks like local resources delivered immediately when needed, concrete supports, right? Supportive, consistent connection, not a hotline call, an IA worker, an ongoing worker, a therapist, a OT, not a bunch of different people. I need a person I can count on. Natural community supports, valuing and building rather than disconnecting family ties, and having a family-driven, culturally specific support available. Then we asked the question, how might we know if we were getting close to an unsystem? And we developed these guiding principles to help us kind of know these are the hallmarks of an unsystem. And they are protecting relational connections as sacred, which means we only separate families as a nuclear option because the fallout is wide-reaching, like a nuclear blast. So it doesn't just affect the family and the child, but affects so many around that family, extended family, and community. We nurture the capacity for joy, not just in our children and our families, but in ourselves. Helping people shouldn't hurt us, right? It shouldn't take away from our capacity to parent and partner well when we're helping other people to do the same, or we're doing it wrong. It should be a joyful thing. Insisting on racial equity and radical inclusion, which means, as you might imagine, going back to the beginning assumptions of our work, attending to the implicit and explicit bias and the systemic and individual racism upon which our work was formed and built, and continues to practice that way. Daring to share power with our families, with our youth, and with each other. So when organizations are like, that's mine, you can't have it, then we get into trouble because we're only going to solve this problem together. It's way too big for any one person or organization. Committing to intergenerational well-being all the way up and down the family tree. Trusting the wisdom of children and families to design their own futures, and doing what love would do, right? So now we have these great ideas, but they're just ideas. An unsystem, awesome. Guiding principles, that sounds great. But what do we do about it, right? What do we do? And what we came to after talking to a group of leaders after the 10 of 10 design event was we need to start trying out these practices. And so we did a national call for who wants to make this real, who wants to put it in real life. Yeah. And we had 10 systems respond to us and say, we want to try it. We want to try to build an unsystem in our community. And we tried to talk all 10 of them out of it. And we succeeded in talking 5 out and 5 stayed. And that's how they were selected. The 5 that stayed were the Eastern Service region of Iowa, which is 14 counties, Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, Waupaca County, Wisconsin, Cass County, North Dakota, and Washington County, Maryland, which is in, southern Maryland and Appalachia. And so that group is what we call the Amelia Unsystem Innovation Cohort. And each one of the leaders brought like a deputy or a second, and then we assigned a lived experience guide and a professional guide to each system. And Jessica, Dr. Price, has been with us as a professional guide in the system, helping us to make the work better. So professional guide's job is to say, you can do more faster, or let me help that solve that problem with you, or other people are doing this good work, or the research says this. And then the lived experience guides can say, that wouldn't work for me or my family, or think about it from this lived experience perspective. So this is the cohort. This cohort started in 2018, and these folks came for the first year every single month to meet with us in our office. This is in the olden days when we used to be in person without masks. I look at it now, it's kind of like watching movies where everybody's smoking in the office and you're just like, I see this and I start to have this panic attack, like they're sitting so close, and no mask. You might recognize Corey Best. I think he might be, some of y'all might know Corey here. And there I am talking about the diagram I shared with you. So they came together every single month for a year, and then every other month. And now, of course, we're virtual in our 3rd year of this to build a proof of concept that child welfare agencies can become primary prevention agencies. So we're fundamentally rethinking our purpose. How do we keep children safely with, not from? How do we keep children safely with their families, not from their families? That's our job now. That's the key question. And just a little history and systems walkthrough. We used to think about kids as property. You could do whatever you wanted. You owned them. And then we said, oh, that's not working well. Kids are getting hurt. They should be in a safe place. And we started rounding them up and putting them in orphanages, or putting them up on the trained platform, up for adoption, where people working in farming communities would take them and place them out. And then we said, well, they really need to be with individuals. And so we started redistributing children to other families, and had a period of mass family separation and readoption, especially cross-culturally, as we separated Black, Brown, and Indigenous families at incredibly disproportionate rates. And that is a period in which we're still living. And then next, we're moving to understanding this is the evolution, right? You know better, you do better. The evolution is, oh, it's really not about saving the children as individuals. Turns out children are born into families, and they thrive in their families. They thrive in their culture. They thrive in their communities. And so now we're thinking about, how do we keep children in their families, in their extended family, or in their communities? So our new roles are instead about keeping children safely with their families while, and this is the part we're still building here because our funding and our laws don't support this quite yet. Family First starts to get there a little bit, but it's just a beginning, while simultaneously supporting parents to safely parent. So this is one of my favorite current questions that we always ask, which is, what would it take to keep every child safely at home or safely in their family? What would it take to help families who are struggling? And there's a series of 4 questions about that in Iowa, every judge in a pilot study began asking these 4 questions about, Can we move someone in to keep the family safe? Can we, remove the person that's a danger from the family? If we have to remove the child, can they go with the parent? So they ask these series of questions, and we're able from the bench to reduce removals by 50% just by asking some questions about what would it take to keep this child safe. So that plays into. I'm going to get to your questions in just a minute here in the chat. So there is free on our website, and let me just say, you can, the slides I sent, they're available to anybody who wants them. I ask that you attribute to Aaliyah, but you can use anything you want. All of these things I'm talking about are free for download on the website. So the early innovation, the early case study of the innovation cohorts available for download, and more about all of those systems is there. And the other thing that's there is a newly released year 1 cohort report. So that cohort, which represents 4 states and 14 counties, worked together in the first year, reduced the foster care placements by 12% and showed a 37% reduction in residential placements. That's without changing the laws, without changing the rules, without changing the funding streams and how they work. They were able to do it by changing their mindset, changing how they feel and think about what children and families need to thrive. The first year of these outcomes in North Dakota, they decreased their foster care intake by 43%. In Wapaka, they had been decreasing for years and actually got down to 0 kids in care in that county, and hired 3 full-time prevention social workers at the front end to decrease their deep dive service. In Iowa, they started using child safety conferences and were able to avoid removal for 94% of youth referred. In Eau Claire, the number of kids living in residential dropped 40% in a year. And in Washington County, year over year, the number of children removed dropped by 61%, from 96 to 37. So those are some of the things that we learned. So let me take a breath before I tell you what we've learned. Let me see what I've got here in the chat. How will we get to the unsystem when we are now focused on formal evaluation with the new federal laws? So all of the work that we do in developing change, we do within the current laws and the current funding streams. And it has been my experience that you can get enormous gains on the front end if you change the way people think. When people start to think differently, they start to act differently. And so all of the gains that we have seen have been without changing any funding or any laws. It's changing people's mindsets about what children need to thrive. And what children need to thrive is an uninterrupted sense of belonging. And once you interrupt it, once it's interrupted, then you've got lifelong predictive harm depending on how long it's interrupted for. So you really want to watch that. How can we keep children safely with their family when there's psychoneurological issues and no to limited resources available? So I want you to hear me use the word family and not parents. I use the word family and not parents. And so sometimes children cannot live safely with their parents. They might be able to have relationship, but they can't live safely alone with their parents. And so we've seen all kinds of things work where another relative moves in, or they move in with another relative, the parents and the children, or where the children move in with another relative. But the idea that children have no one, when I hear children have no one, what I hear is we have not looked long and hard enough to find their someone. Or we have not supported the people who they do have to be able to safely parent, that they might need their trauma treatment, which is underlying addiction, and instead we're just treating the addiction. And that we have not yet shifted to provide support to folks to help them to safely parent within the family. So I'm going to move to what we've learned. These are our top 5 insights. Number 1, well, trying to build an UN system, we must prepare and take care of ourselves and our team. So the number 1 threat to change efforts failing is leaders being ousted or burning out and turnover in the workforce. Because if you are trying to do things in a new way and you're constantly turning people over, no matter what you do or train or teach, you're losing that capacity. So taking care of ourselves is number 1. Number 2, thinking differently about the work, shifting mindsets, and getting real clarity about the alternative narrative. So if you're not removing children to keep them safe, what are you doing? And how do you help people in the community and in your other related systems like your GAL and CASA and judges and DAs? How do you help them understand why you're doing what you're doing? And change the language that you use, right? So we talk about pain-based behaviors instead of defiance. We talk about uninterrupted senses of belonging and what children need to thrive, and thinking about supply versus demand. So we switch the language and get creative about our problem solving. In making the old way harder, some of the things that we found is to put barriers in between things you don't want to see to slow them down. So for example, in Iowa, they had the Child Safety Conference. It meant that leaders had to drive to that conference day or night. So you were getting somebody out of bed to do that, which really slowed you down. Like, do I really need to do this? I need to think hard if I'm getting a leader out of bed. And it put kind of blocks in place so that people had time to start thinking differently and be creative. We also, in this old way harder, really thinking about how do we invest in healing and then reinvest in prevention. So what are the ways we can take any savings from getting more youth to permanency and reinvest those in prevention? Betting on families' resilience and capacity for change is another lesson learned. To increase constituent and engagement, family voice, and developing solutions alongside our families and our communities, and to really believe deeply that parents love their children and they're trying to do the best they can and to help them do the best they can. And then the last one's expanding your group of helpers, really leveraging whatever support you can from families, from other families who have made it through the system, from other youth with lived experience, from other nonprofits, but really not trying to do to make changes yourself. Other people on your team if you're in direct practice, or your supervisor, but expand your group of helpers. The obstacles were really capturing accurate and meaningful data across 14 counties that meant the same thing, apples to apples. Helping some largely white, largely rural counties tackle the issues of anti-racism, race equity, and bias in their systems. Even people feeling like they, didn't have a place to go to learn more in their county, or people with whom they could connect. Incorporating family voice and lived experience voice. Some communities really just have a lack of resources. We haven't yet developed trauma-informed treatment services or addiction services. And then the community pushback. There's been strong pushback when things start to change. They say, they're not removing kids over there, so they're not doing anything, right? Or the police get mad because if you're not removing kids, they've got to respond to more calls. Or the schools get mad because if you're not removing kids, they have to deal with more behavioral challenges. So really having a counter narrative of, we're not doing that, but we are doing this, and this is why, and this is what the results we're seeing, gets really important, because that pushback is pretty significant there. And then just to say here that this is kind of the cutting edge of new ways of work, which is in working in human-centered design to really build vision with families and then put it into practice. So we're talking about family and community co-design. And what I mean about this is a very substantial and radical shift in our work. It is working with families to divest the power and the resource of the department into the community. And so the best thing I can compare this with here is what the conversation that's happening right now with police reform. So if you think now, all the calls come into 911, whether it's, you know, a real criminal emergency or somebody who needs help or a mental health crisis or, you know, a loose dog. I mean, everything comes in through 911. And so the police in all their power and authority are responding as though there is a criminal component to everything. So it would be like if we had no primary care doctors, every time you had anything, you know, you went to the emergency room and what would happen there. And it's kind of what we've ended up with in child welfare with our hotlines, right? Everything comes in. And what we're finding is that about 80% of the calls really should go to a helpline, not a hotline, but a helpline. These folks need, you know, people are worried about the kids. They're dirty. They're not dressed for the weather. They're, you know, alone in the front yard. It's like these families need help. That so thinking about family co-design is really around this idea of how might we really reserve the full capacity of the department for child abuse emergencies and divest to the community the responses for concrete supports and help in times of need. And they would design that, how that would work, and they would choose how that would work. But I heard a parent describe this in DC at a training that said, every time a parent calls for help or someone calls on behalf of a parent for help right now, they risk losing the most precious thing in their life. And so guess what? People don't call for help when they need it. And they certainly aren't calling earlier. And they're certainly not calling to prevent things because they know if they call for help that they could risk losing the most precious thing in their life. So we could catch people at an earlier point in their struggle. We could get them support earlier and they'd need a lot less. They just need a little to get, you know, some concrete supports to get on the right track or some help with earlier on in an addiction. But that's not going to happen now when the people who have removal authority for your family, they can legally separate your family. And we all know, friends, we all know, child welfare is like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can never leave. It's a lot like I'm talking about police reform, right? It's like once you get involved, there you be, right? There is, you got a record, you got engagement, now they know you, it follows you forever. It's the same. And so how do we separate out the need for help and harm and all the in between? And how do we help earlier without people risking losing their most precious? Yeah, that's right, Courtney. We go in for a kitchen remodel and they want to demo the house down to the studs. I haven't heard that one, but I'm gonna tell you that I can relate to that's what I'm saying here. So this is the kind of new thinking is guess who knows how to do this better? Families who are experiencing the problem, right? And so we're gonna go in community and family and have them redesign what that should look like. So this is just one of my favorite diagrams I want to share in case you all are feeling it right now, which is this is what we're doing when we're building a new way. So on the left-hand side, we've got old way. So all the way we used to do our work is scaling down. See that? We're doing less and less and less and less and less and less. But you can't build a new emergency room, even if it's cheaper to serve patients, even if it has better outcomes, even if it's better for people. You can't shut down your emergency room while you build a new one. You do it at the same time. So at the same time, we're scaling up the new way of work so that at the end, we'll do it all the new way. So scaling down old while you're scaling up new leaves you in this middle part. Where it's like, I don't know what the rules are. We used to do this and we can't anymore. We used to say this and we can't anymore. Are we doing it this way or that way? And it gets really scary for people who have investment in this old way. So make no mistake that there is a lot of money, a lot of power, and there is a very significant industrial complex of separating families and and adoption and other pieces. And so when things start to change, people who can feel the power slipping, like I used to be the expert, or I used to know, and now I don't know what I'm doing anymore. It's all shifting. They start to get really afraid, and this middle part has anxiety and ambiguity. And what you'll feel is people trying to pull back to the way it was, right? So when things start to change, they want to go back to how it was, where I knew the rules, where it worked for me, where I felt safe. But the thing is, it didn't work for everybody. It didn't work for our families, it didn't work for our kids. And so we're starting to scale up to this new way of work instead of going back to make it how it was. And so by the time you start to feel that real sense of like, oh my gosh, this is all changing so quickly, you're over a little closer to the side of the new way, and the momentum is there, and you'll be building into the new way. So there is no going back once you know better. You can't unknow that. So we're building a booklet right now we're going to release soon, which is, we're going to have to rename, but inside we call it right now the new way, old way, new way, old way. And we're kind of saying, we used to do this and now we do this. We used to say this and now we do this. For judges, for foster parents, for social workers, for therapists, what is the difference between the old and the new? I'm wondering, what signs are you seeing that we're moving over, right? Moving over towards this new way, scaling up over here. What are the signs you're seeing that we're moving away from old ways to new ways? Can you share with me some bits of optimism and hope that you're seeing, that things are shifting to a new way of work? Can you share that out loud or in the chat?
We used to limit parent and child contact to basically the visitation, but now during the pandemic, they've been able to have more virtual visual calls. So allowing them to continue that even after the pandemic would be a new way.
Yeah, and just really the emphasis and the understanding the importance on family connection, right? That's even a new thing. It was like before, it was parents didn't deserve it, or once a week was often enough, but understanding the importance of that is even new. Thanks for sharing that. Who else? I've seen arbitrary case plan task, individualized case plan now with parents, right? That's a new way. Working on keeping more children within home, working on keeping more children together within home. What else are you seeing? What did we used to do and now we're leaning towards a new way of work? Focusing on conditions for return rather than a checklist of case tasks. And are you asking questions like, why not? Why can't we return? Why not? Why not today? I promise you, if you took my kids, I would act in ways that would not qualify me for reunification. I would quickly meet some diagnostic criteria, and you may hear words you hadn't heard in a long while. So I wonder about some of the behaviors we see in parents and children being connected to the disconnection. Casey did a study where they returned home a bunch of older youth, and within 6 months of return home, they no longer exhibited the diagnostic criteria for the diagnosis they had, and they had all stopped their meds, right? It was the separation that was causing their behavioral challenges. So I see some individual local efforts. That's good. We're seeing a lot of old way, new way. We're seeing a lot of people talking about prevention. We're talking about upstream is so much more common. We're seeing a lot of people thinking about parents and the role of parents. We're thinking about, I'm hearing a lot more people talk about building anti-racism, the lens of anti-racism into our work, and thinking about bias and blind removals and the ways disproportionality has impacted families and children of color. That was not so common even 6 months ago. Friends, I live in South Minneapolis. I live 17 blocks from the site of George Floyd's murder. And so, you know, that's really real here, but I'm seeing it around the country too. Just a new attention to including lived experience voice from children, youth, and families, and thinking through anti-racism, an anti-racist lens as we're thinking about the implicit bias in what we're doing. Those are really new, adding in consumer voice and leading, saying out loud what we all have known and seen. Those are new things that I feel like are good indications of new ways of work. I see the differential response culture here in Durango, and building those connections regardless of whether or not they can parent full-time, right? That's good. Focusing on why we got involved in the first place. And that's sort of that unsystem idea, is like unraveling that. Like, do the conditions even exist why we did first removal? 15-year-old is not the same level of vulnerability as a 6-year-old. And so thinking about, instead of meeting all this checklist of things or conditions, might we just ask the simple question, would they be safe enough if we returned them today? So thinking about some of those things too. So there's lots of indicators for me that things are moving forward to new ways of work. And that makes me feel very optimistic, because I think more of us are aligned. There's a lot more momentum, and COVID created conditions for us to understand that things could be different. And so one of the things that we saw was that hotline calls went down in some jurisdictions by more than 60%. And upon further investigation, children were not less safe, right? What they learned in one jurisdiction I work with is that 60% of the calls actually came from the schools, and the schools are very unreliable reporters. So very few of the cases actually converted to substantiated abuse. It's just that they called everything in, like not a right jacket, dirty, lice. They called everything in. And it turned out that even though there were a lot less calls, children were not less safe, and families were figuring it out without the over intervention and surveillance that was happening, right? They figured it out. So I put up that slide. That's really what I was hoping to share with you today. And I have one last slide and one last piece to talk to you about after we're done with questions. But I wanted to save some time for other questions or comments. So if you could think about how this is resonating with you, or what questions you might have. I'll start with the ones in the chat, and you're free to unmute and ask as well. So, do I think we'll see the unsystem within our lifetime? Yes, I do. Here's what I think. I think, and I love this question. I got to go back and see who asked me this question. Courtney. Okay. So here's why I think that. The reason why I think that is because if you look backwards for the pace of change, you're looking in the wrong direction. I want you to think about your life 6 months ago. I want you to think about your life on March 1st and think about your life today. And I want you to think about how radically different things are, like that. Things that we thought would never happen. I have been working with systems to let their workers home office for a decade, less than that, 5 years. And over the weekend, no way. Over the weekend, they found a way to home office 2,000 workers in a system. Over the week, from Thursday to Monday, after saying like, no way. So change is on a rapid pace moving forward. Technology has accelerated our change pace, and lots of other conditions and variables. So things are moving really, really, really rapidly in lots of areas. So I used to say 2 years ago that I thought we would look back 5 years and say, you what? You used to separate kids from their families? And now I think we'll look back at that and say, that was crazy. What were you all doing? And I think that'll happen within the next 5 years. So I do think we'll see it in our lifetime. I'm reading some of these other questions here too. You can still hear me, right? Yeah, I pushed a button I didn't mean to push. There's a light on. I don't know what it means. Let's see. Do you think there are still some situations when a kid needs to be placed in a foster home? So I think there are conditions where children need to be removed from their parental home in order to stay safe. And I would advocate that we do everything possible to place that child with what I will call an already trusted adult. So that's someone who the child knows and loves or to whom they're related. So might they be able to be with someone who a friend's, hopefully someone in their own family. If that's not possible, a friend's family or extended family or neighbor or in the community. But to move a child from a really hard situation at home directly into the home of someone who is a stranger to them, into real stranger care, right, is a very traumatic thing. And I want to ask you, one of our guiding principles, I didn't say the last one, I forgot the most important one, which is do what love would do. That means when you're not sure what to do, you do what you would do for someone you loved. So I want to ask you, if something happened to you and you couldn't safely parent, where would you want your babies? In a very well background checked, well-trained foster home with people of another race who are being paid to care for your child, who you'd never met and they'd never met, right? So I am of the avoid it at all costs. I am absolutely, so now you imagining we're properly resourced to investigate this, imagining we're properly resourced to ensure that there is absolutely no one in the extended family, in the community, who is already trusted or known to the child. There's just nobody. Do we need to have a foster home in that situation? Absolutely. And then we better be working day and night to find somebody in the very short order near future. So that's where I would say. So in Central Florida, we have conservative and set in our ways and means. How do we get players on the board with kind of this unsystem ideology? So I think there's a lot of civic engagement that needs to happen actively for local boards who control this, for boards of directors, boards of supervisors, boards of governors, to be thinking about that. And part of the big thing we do is shift mindset, so help people to see it differently, using the research, using the data, and using story from people who have lived the trauma of separation. And so really thinking about how do we position people to understand what we're trying to do and why. That, if you look at the research, if you look at the social return on investment, if you look at the outcomes, if you look at the lifelong predictive harm and trauma, there's just no good reason to keep at what we're doing except for the few who benefit. There are people who benefit from the way it is, and they're not really interested in the change process. But, it's our job to use what a mentor of mine would call gentle action. So that's it. Like I said, I'm a builder, not a fighter. I'm not blowing things up. I don't want to blow the system up. But how do we use persistent, gentle action to make the case, to tell the story, to shift the mindset, to form relationships, to ask people hard questions like, what would you want for your own children? And to continue to push that change forward. And we are building momentum, friends. I mean, family first passed in the current administration. I want to remind you of that. Right? And people are talking prevention through the current administration in ways they have never talked about in this country. It's built massive momentum. So if you're asking me, I see signs of hope. And the other reason I feel hope is because you don't have to convince everyone. You just have to convince the right people. Right? That change theory would say if you get to 16% of people, things shift. It's like, remember a while ago, how many of y'all have kids who wore those little rubber band bracelets? I'm talking about what are they, rainbow looms? What were they, right? So like nobody had them, and then a minute later, everybody had them, and it was an emergency for you to get to the craft store and buy every color rubber. It was an emergency, or they wouldn't fit in. And then one day it was super uncool, and they were giving all those kits to their younger cousins. So that's how change works. It's right. You don't have to convince everybody. You just got to convince the cool kids. You just got to convince the people with power, the people of influence, and then things shift. But you don't have to do the whole thing. Jessica, is there anything I didn't cover you want me to cover that you've heard me say before?
Hi, I think you did excellent as always. I'm always going to ask when Florida can be in the next cohort, but I know you might not be having another cohort.
Well, and we might and we might not. We'll see how that next step is. I mean, I think, you know, we've learned so much in the last 3 years that our approach now is so different that we're thinking really around, instead of shifting the current system to think about moving things to prevention. That's yes and true. And the integration of families is so different now. So really thinking about how might we have a cohort in the future where families run the cohort, and thinking about it in a different way. Monica. Everybody's got somebody in their family they don't trust, or you don't want to sit next to at Thanksgiving. Everybody's got somebody, but by and large, I promise you, even my relatives who don't agree with me, I would take them to love my child first before I had to move on. Right. So I invite you in the chat or in discussion to ask anything else, but I am going to also put this slide up, which is my contact information. And I've done a TEDx talk on the human need for belonging. Kind of belonging is my thing, right? It's what I think we all need to thrive. And so that's available there, as is my email and our website. And the reason why I really want to share that with you is because all the resources I talked about, all the evidence that I presented is free for download on the website. And the one I didn't talk about that's also there is called the Healing Guidebook. And that's 89 pages of explaining pain-based behaviors and how trauma shows up for people. And I mean people, because if you're in child welfare, research would say 70 to 90% of us in child welfare have experienced some kind of early childhood trauma. So it really explains that, and then has different interventions for use that are more non-traditional than traditional talk therapy. And so that's free for download and available for use as well, if you're interested in that. I did want to also say, you know, would love you to get connected, because we're also going to be releasing another social return on investment study about kin. So what do we know when we invest in kin versus investing in unrelated people, and what do we get back from that investment rather than the negative investment of foster care? And we also have this new way, again, we're going to call it something else. It's inside baseball. We call it Old Way, New Way book, about by role of how we used to do and how we will do. That'll be available too. And all those resources are just free for download. So you're welcome to any of those. I'm going to leave one more quick thing. It's hard times, friends. And I saw a lot in the chat about people feeling exhausted and retention and turnover. And I want to leave you with this poem someone sent to me at the beginning of the pandemic that has just meant a lot to me, because it's both and. People ask me if I'm optimistic. Yeah, I'm worried and optimistic at the same time, right? So I'll just read this to you quick. It was sent to me by someone in the field who was sent to it by a yoga studio in Atlanta. And it says, "We are home and resting, and we have never worked harder and are exhausted. We are meditating and freaking out on our kids. We're acknowledging the silver linings, and we are in the throes of profound grief. We are organizing and cleaning and gardening, and we are drinking too much, eating too much, and wishing we could just go see our friends. Both and. This is the moment we must let go of convention and constraint. This is the moment we must let go of the shoulds and the coulds and the pressures of self-inflicted guilt. There's so much pressure right now to do and be a certain way, yet none of us has ever done this before. Who is to say there's a right way to live through a pandemic?" And so I'll leave you with that and tell you in closing of my profound gratitude of people who are thinking about new ways of work and taking action in your own place and space within your own scope of influence and power and authority to make new choices, to ask new questions, and to act in new ways on behalf of our children and families. Because when we know better, and now we do, we know better, you can no longer say you didn't know. we must do better. So have a great day, and I welcome your comments or thoughts. I'll stay on for a little bit if somebody had something more individual. I'll make sure to share that poem and the PowerPoint with the organizers, and you can use them freely as you wish.
That'd be great.
Thank you.